All right, guys, welcome back. We are now up to topic 7.10, the New Deal. And I'll go ahead and tell you this is a really, really big topic. So rather than trying to do one massive video, I thought that might be too much. We're going to break this up probably in at least 2 or 3 different videos because it's just such a big topic. And I'll be honest, I have tried to slim this topic down over the years to not maybe get so into the details on all the individual programs and everything. And I think I've really stripped out all but the bare bones. So even so, this is a big, big topic that's going to take us a while to go through. So be patient with me as we go through the goals and effects of FDR's New Deal. That's what's on our agenda for today. All right, let's begin with FDR himself, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, of course, he is related to another president, Theodore Roosevelt. They were distant cousins. And one thing that a lot of Americans didn't know back then, but most Americans do today, is that FDR was paralyzed as president. He was wheelchair bound, and he struggled greatly with mobility. So you might think, okay, well, how would something like that affect him as a politician? Because FDR is one of the most accomplished and famous politicians in all of American history. The first thing I want to say about his paralysis is that it didn't happen from birth. Okay, a lot of people know he had polio, and polio is something we generally associate with children. They were the most vulnerable to this disease. He actually contracted it at age 39, which was rather unusual. And so for 39 years of his life, he was every bit as mobile as everyone else around him. And then all that was taken from him. And he, had to learn how to adjust without basically the use of the lower half of his body. And this is something that really, I think, got into FDR's political character, and that being so limited all of a sudden and being oftentimes dependent on others for help put FDR in a position where he learned more empathy and tolerance and humility, and also the need for perseverance and hard work and strength of will. All of these features really in one way or the other can be, I think, tied back to his paralysis. Now, in terms of a politician, he was fantastic, okay? He was a guy who just kind of has something special, kind of the extra gear when it comes to politics, in that he really was great at connecting with people. He was a great speaker. He had a great presence to him. He always had this winning smile. He just seemed to have something that attracted people. Now, while he was popular with his supporters, he definitely drew a fair amount of criticism and ire from those who didn't kind of fit into his vision. Now, this kind of helps if you know a little bit of background on him. Roosevelt was from a very wealthy family, the Roosevelts, of course, and their origins go all the way back to the Dutch settlement of what was New Netherland back in the old days. And he came from this privileged upper class family, and there were a lot of people in that class that he lived among and grew up with who saw him as kind of a traitor, in that he's going to pursue government policies that were targeting the so-called forgotten man. Now, what he meant by forgotten man is basically the people who weren't succeeding, the people who are being hurt the most by this Great Depression that's already underway, of course, by 1929 and then into 1930. So as we look at these 2 pictures of FDR on the campaign trail, you'll notice that he's standing, which might seem kind of unusual given what we know about FDR and his disability. The thing about FDR was his disability was certainly something that he was not going to be super out in public about, because the fear was that some people may choose not to vote for him because they saw him as weak if he couldn't, walk across the room or something. And so occasionally in public he would, and you can see this picture here of him air quotes walking. And the way this would happen is Basically, they would put very heavy braces on his legs to lock his knees in place, and they could kind of get him up on his legs, and then he would hold on to someone, and then often usually have some rails as well, as you can see, and this would allow him to kind of shuffle forward and give the appearance that he is walking, enough for the crowd to kind of buy into the fact that, okay, he may have some physical limitations, but he's up on his feet anyways. Let's look at now another Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt. Of course, Franklin Roosevelt's wife. Actually, she was Theodore Roosevelt's niece, by the way. So, in other words, her father, Elliot Roosevelt, was Teddy Roosevelt's brother. She really set a lot of trends as First Lady. She is in many ways the first really modern First Lady. Someone who is a little more active in politics, someone who goes out and gives speeches, lobbies Congress, and does what she can to support her husband's political, goals and plans. She also had a really interesting upbringing and frankly sad upbringing. I mentioned a moment ago, Elliot Roosevelt, her father, was Teddy Roosevelt's brother. He had a very tragic end. He basically drank himself to death. And then Eleanor's mother was not a very loving mother. They were very distant. And so she had a very sad childhood growing up, frankly. And this kind of, I think in many ways, informed her life as First Lady, because they called her the conscience of the New Deal, because she was someone who really pushed Franklin Roosevelt, her husband, on social issues, things like racism, looking out for people who were kind of left behind by the Great Depression. She was just instrumental in kind of keeping her husband, Franklin Roosevelt, kind of on that path of trying his best to help people who needed help during the Great Depression. Now, of course, in the 1932 election, we all know what the key issue is going to be. It is, of course, the Great Depression. And so you have Franklin Roosevelt. I'll get the right Roosevelt in a second. Franklin Roosevelt challenging the incumbent, Herbert Hoover. And we talked a lot about Herbert Hoover in the last section about some of his activities in trying to address the onset of the Great Depression. And he was seen by quite a few people as not perhaps doing enough. And FDR is going to call him on that. And that's basically what he's running on, is I'll do more than Hoover. Now, specifically in 1932, when he is nominated for president, he gives his acceptance speech, and he says in the speech, "I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people." A new deal. So, in other words, what does that look like? Well, he was kind of vague on that, but it certainly sounded promising, because Herbert Hoover had nothing like this. Herbert Hoover's plan was basically just, hey, things are getting better. I promise they will. At some point, it'll get better. Just hold on. And FDR's like, no, if you put me into power, I'm going to do something right now. Like, immediately, I'm going to do something to help you. And those two styles could not have been more different. FDR's out there smiling, shaking hands. Hoover just was a very different person in terms of his actual personality. He was not the baby kissing, handshaking type kind of guy. He just didn't understand why people didn't really believe in his policies, and didn't understand why they couldn't be more patient and just hold on a little bit longer because things are supposedly getting better. And in the end, people were voting for change. Okay, honestly, anybody could have won this election against Hoover. Franklin Roosevelt certainly is going to make the most of it, but anybody probably could have beat Hoover. I mean, Hoover couldn't even win his home state of Iowa, and that's saying something. He gets absolutely blown out in this election. The popular vote is nowhere near close, and the electoral vote is just an absolute, destruction of Herbert Hoover. All right, let's get into FDR's plan here. He calls them, we're going to call them rather, the 3 R's. And this is a good review of another Roosevelt's 3 C's. And if you don't remember, they were control the corporations. That means trust busting, conservation, and consumer protection. So before we get into the 3 R's for Franklin Roosevelt, let's put him into office. So he gives his first inaugural address in March of 1933. By the way, this is the last time that the president was sworn in March. It was later moved back to January. And in this speech, he famously said, "Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And what he was trying to say with that is, if we let fear get in our way, we won't be able to do the bold things we need to tackle this Great Depression, that we can't be too hesitant to act for fear of failure. We need to act, and if we fail, we'll fix it as we go, kind of thing. So it's really a declaration of war against the Great Depression is what he's calling for. So one of the first things Franklin Roosevelt does now that he's president is he declares what's known as a bank holiday. That does not mean the bank goes on vacation. Rather, that means the banks are going to shut down. And this is a reaction to the massive bank failures we'd seen in the first couple of years of the Great Depression. If we can close the banks, they can't go out of business, basically, and then we can try our best to kind of fix the banks and get them reopened. Now, this is known during this time period, but also in modern politics, as FDR's first 100 days. Now, 100 days, of course, is really not that long, right? It's only about 3.5 months. But in those first 100 days, FDR, because he has a Democratic Congress behind him, passed an absolute flood of new laws, okay? I mean, there were just laws after laws after laws after laws. Because, again, FDR is trying all kinds of new things. And because the Congress is backed by him, because they're Democratic, both the House and the Senate, he can basically do what he wants. Now, this idea of using the first 100 days as kind of a measuring stick of success for presidents is still a thing. Every time a new president comes into office, the first thing people say is like, what is he going to accomplish in the first 100 days? And then after those 100 days, people use it kind of as like a report card. Okay, what grade does he get? Did he or she accomplish what they set out to do in those 100 days? Now, let's look at FDR's goals for this New Deal. I mentioned a moment ago, they're called the 3 R's. So the first R is relief. That means giving direct, immediate help to people who are losing out. You know, that maybe they're in danger of losing their home. Maybe they have lost their home. Maybe they can't feed their family. Like, they need immediate assistance right now. So this is like, you know, calling 911. Someone's going to come into your house right now, kind of thing. It's an emergency. Then there's recovery. Recovery is more about kind of trying to get industry back on track, getting jobs back open, keeping businesses from going under. So recovery is just like it sounds. It's more long-term than relief is. And then there's reform. With reform, we're doing what it says. We're going to try to make changes to the economic system. A lot of the problems that have led to the Great Depression, we're going to try to weed those things out and make sure a new depression couldn't happen again. So again, down here at the bottom, you can see relief is immediate help for people. Recovery is more about stimulating the economy. And then reform is fixing some structural problems in the economy to prevent future Great Depressions and making sure that people have faith in the economy going forward. So let's return back to one of the first things FDR did. Remember, we talked about how he had the bank holidays, shut down the banks and all that. And FDR's got a bit of a challenge before him. He has to explain to voters and the American people how banks work and why you should put your money back in banks. And this is, you know, banking is a pretty complex system. A lot of people have no clue. I don't know that much about banking, you know. It's really a complex picture. So if you want to make this simple and you want to reach the American people and explain what you want to do with banks, the best way you could do this at this time was through the radio. Okay, so he's going to go on and speak directly to the American people. And these are known as his fireside chats. So his first fireside chat dealt with this, you know, basically explaining the banking situation to the American people, telling them that we're reforming the banks, we're getting the banks back open, and he's also telling the people that it's okay, once the banks reopen, it's okay and safe to put your money back in the banks. And a lot, you know, the people listened. The people of America did what they were told to do, in the sense that they took their money and many of them put them back in banks, even though banks had a very recent history of failing. Now, certainly not everybody. There were people who were scarred for life and never once put money in a bank ever again. But, enough people did to get the banking system back on track. So again, this is the first of his fireside chats. He went on to have 30 of these throughout his presidency. They tended to be, half an hour length or so, sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more. They were in very simple language in a way that people could sort of, get behind. And it was, for a lot of people, it was almost like the president was in their house with them, talking to them and explaining things to them. Now, why would it be safe to put your money back in banks? And the reason it is because of something called the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act. And the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act established something called the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC for short. What this means is, if your bank is a member of this Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, then your deposits up to $5,000 are insured. So if a bank, again, it has to be a member of FDIC, if it's a member of this program, and you can see this bank over here, they're a member, that's why they've got that right there. If they're a member, then if the bank fails, you will get your money back up to $5,000. And this insurance thing is paid for by the banks. They're basically kind of pooling money, and that pool can then compensate people who lost their money up to the $5,000 mark. This is still very much with us, although the limit, I believe, is up to $250,000, if my memory serves me well. So again, if you're doing banking, make sure your bank is a member of FDIC. This is going to help end those the rapid fire bank failures we had seen in the early days of the Great Depression. Now, it's not going to end all bank failures. Bank failures still happen today, but it's going to really help in the rampant bank failures. All right, now let's get into some job creation. And FDR is struggling with really an unprecedented circumstance in which upwards of 1/4 of all American workers who were searching for jobs could not find them. Okay, so 25% unemployment rate is unheard of. There's, nothing like this. Even in the darkest days of like the Great Recession that started in 2008, 2009, I think it was maybe 10% unemployment, somewhere in the ballpark. So this is really, again, unprecedented. And so what FDR has to do is he's got to figure out a way to get people back to work. And he basically, with his advisors, of course, not just him personally, they hit on this idea of trying to prime the pump. And what that means is what we'll do is we'll use federal money, okay, to assist unemployed people. And then once they have extra money in their pocket, they're going to spend that money. And once they spend that money, businesses will reopen because they'll have more consumer demand. They'll be hiring more people. And before you know it, the economy will be back in full steam. So this is kind of like jump starting a car with a dead battery. And again, that's the plan. Now, what does this look like in the real world? This means oftentimes creating jobs for people paid for by the federal government. A great example of this would be the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC. And this was targeting young unemployed men, so 18, 19, 20-year-olds. And the reason they were in particular interest is these guys were, many of them have just finished up school, and they're trying to get into some sort of job to start their life, maybe get married, start a family and all that. And there just weren't a lot of jobs to be had. So you're going to have a disproportionate number of young unemployed people because they just don't have a lot of job skills to offer an employer for scarce jobs. So let's give them something to do. And that something would be part of this CCC. And the CCC was operated kind of like the military in that you had, camps, you had training, you had uniform, you were employed by the federal government. But instead of fighting foreign enemies, you're doing things like building roads, fighting fires, You're building dams and levees to control flooding. You're helping build national parks, roads and facilities in those parks. They're going to plant an astounding 3 billion trees during the CCC. A couple of images here from the CCC, and again, you can see there's definitely a resemblance here with the military. The CCC was a very popular program. It was widespread all across America. In fact, you can see on the map there, just all over the place, these CCC camps were in place. All right, now let's get into our final topic in this video, the demagogues of the 1930s. And you might be wondering, what in the world is a demagogue? So the definition I've got here for you: a demagogue is a person who appeals to the emotions, fears, prejudices, and ignorance of the lower class in order to gain power. So in other words, there's someone who can really whip up support among people who maybe they're not terribly well educated, and they don't have a lot of sophistication when it comes to politics and economics and things. You're going to use their resentment of the system, and you're going to inflame those fears, and you're going to ride those fears into office, basically, is what you're going to do. All right, guys, we're going to look now at two demagogues from this time period. The first was a Catholic priest from Michigan named Father Charles Coughlin. And Father Coughlin was originally a supporter of FDR. And he was, economically anyways, even perhaps more radical than FDR. And he is going to break with FDR eventually because FDR didn't go far enough. He didn't nationalize big businesses. He didn't inflate the currency. A lot of these things that FDR just wouldn't go far enough in Coughlin's viewpoint, and he later breaks from and becomes a major critic of FDR. So he had a newspaper, you can see there, called Social Justice. He also had a radio program, and this is really where his power came from, is from the radio. So basically, he was attracting over 30 million radio listeners to his sermons and his speeches. And the thing about demagogues is that to kind of keep people's attention, you always have to kind of, dial it up every time. And sometimes you have to go even higher. And, eventually, you're at a 7, you have to go to an 8, and then a 9, then a 10, and then you have to go to 11, and you just keep going to keep that wave going. Otherwise, people will kind of get bored with you and turn it off. And he eventually, as we get into the early 1940s, really starts to wade into areas of anti-Semitism, like really just calling out Jews and basically claiming they're disloyal. And it's part of this horrible Jewish conspiracy theory thing that's unfortunately still out there, that supposedly Jews are like behind the scenes controlling everything. He was also, Coughlin, making some rather complimentary comments about fascism and dictators and such, and he just eventually fell out of fashion, especially once we're actually fighting fascists and Americans are fighting and dying against fascism. This guy all of a sudden didn't sound so great, and he kind of fades away. The other demagogue I want to point to is one of my favorite politicians, not because I believe in his policies, but rather he's just so interesting. He was Huey P. Long. He had been the governor of Louisiana. By this point, he's a very powerful senator from Louisiana, and he was known as the Kingfish. That was his political nickname. He was incredibly flamboyant, outspoken. In a time period where you have the rise of dictators, people like Hitler and Mussolini, who make very fiery speeches with very animated body language. This guy really fits in. Huey Long really fits that description. So what gained his popularity nationally was this thing called the Share Our Wealth program. And what Senator Long was proposing was that the federal government would ensure that every American family had a minimum of $5,000 income every year. Now, where's that money coming from? It's going to come from the rich. So classic take from the rich, give to the poor type scenario. And he gained a lot of popularity from this. In fact, so much so that a lot of people in the FDR camp feared that in 1936 that Huey Long might challenge FDR for the Democratic nomination, or maybe even run as a third party and spoil FDR's chances at re-election. None of that, however, was going to come true, because in 1935 he was shot down and killed in the state capital of Louisiana, and that ended one of the more famous political careers in American history. All right, guys, that is all we're going to cover in this first video. I know it's a lot of material, but in our next video, we're going to pick up with this thing called the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. Again, that'll be in video 2.